Today, I'll be ranking every hero change in the Creator Arcade mode from best to worst. Now, since this is just a fun arcade mode, this tier list will not be based on hero viability. Instead, my rankings will be based on both how fun and how generally good these changes are. And remember, this is simply my opinion, so if you disagree, make sure to let me know in the comments. So let's get right into it, starting with Emong's tank changes. First up, we have D.Va. Now, D.Va's changes aren't necessarily bad, both to defense matrix and boosters. The strafing sideways and backwards with boosters is actually pretty nice, but there's just not a lot going on here, and so I can't really warrant putting it any higher than C. Moving on to Doomfist, he actually has gotten quite a few changes, but they're not particularly exciting. They're really just straight up buffs in like every aspect of his kit almost. I mean, the ult change is cool, how the damage scales the longer you hold it, but overall it's a C because there's just nothing interesting happening. When it comes to Junker Queen, the changes aren't necessarily bad, but there's even less being done. I mean, there's not much to say about these. They do something, but I would have liked more, and as you'll see later in the video, that's a recurring theme that keeps coming back, but these changes, they aren't really quite as much as I was expecting from this arcade mode. Next is Mauga, and he's only gotten one change. Now, this is basically just a straight buff to his overrun. It feels pretty good to use because you can just do a huge amount of damage, but it can also feel awful to play against, and it's nothing special, so it has to go into D in my opinion. Orissa's changes, on the other hand, are actually very good. They kind of redistribute her power by making her less tanky by increasing some of her cooldowns, but then they bring back the Overwatch 1 ability, Halt. And Halt is actually a pretty cool ability. It can get a lot of value if you use it properly. Not that I always know how to use it properly, but it is still a cool ability, and I do like these changes overall, so it gets an A. Ramattra's changes, on the other hand, are a bit more boring, more so just because there's not really anything happening. I mean, the primary fight is slightly easier to hit, and the Ravenous Vortex height is increased. Don't get me wrong, the height increase is actually very good because it actually lets you pull down flying characters, which is kind of what it was meant to do in the first place, but overall there's just not much happening. The Ravenous Vortex change will be good if it added to the normal game, but otherwise it's a D tier for me. Now then, Reinhardt. Reinhardt is now good. S tier. Yes, I am biased. Moving on to Hog, and I've seen some debates online on whether or not these changes are actually good, but I personally really like them. But his hook has basically been changed to a Nautilus Q from League, and it can pull you yourself to enemies instead of pulling them to you, but it can also be used on the environment, so you can like hook up onto a wall and get high ground. It's really cool in my opinion. I actually really like it. That change specifically is very fun. Then they take a breather change. Maybe the numbers aren't quite right, but the overall idea of it is still good. As a tank in Overwatch, you should be able to support your team, and Hog can't really do that, so making it so that take a breather gives damage reduction to your teammates is actually quite good. But overall, these changes are really fun, and it's an easy S tier for me. I know some will obviously disagree, but in my opinion, it's probably the best change in the entire patch. Now moving on to Sigma, I mean his changes are fine, the shield regen is nice I guess, and cancelling Grasp is fine, but it feels a little unnecessary to be honest. Decreasing the cooldown on Brock versus providing overhealth is a nerf, in my opinion at least, and Vlogs not being cancelled is very nice, especially when you're playing against something like a Sombra who can just hack you out of it all the time. Overall, even though there's a lot of changes, there's nothing really special going on, and so I can't put it any higher than C. Winston is next, and overall these changes are quite good. In particular, I do really like the secondary fire change, as being able to channel it even further for more damage is quite good in my opinion. And on top of that, the barrier size change is also pretty cool, although I would have liked it if he went a little more extreme with this, increasing it to maybe like 10 meters or something, just because it's an arcade mode. It would be a little bit more fun if it was even more insane, but it's fair enough, you know. Then in terms of a primal, when it creates a barrier upon activation, that's pretty cool, but the increase in melee attack range seems a little bit unnecessary. Overall though, still a good change, and I'd rate it an A. Then we have Wrecking Ball, who there's not much going on here. He's increased the mine radius size, which feels a little unnecessary. I don't really know what that's supposed to do. It just makes him more annoying to play against, if anything. And then the pile driver change is actually quite nice. It means that when you pile drive someone, you can then get another cast without being in the air, which is pretty cool. For someone like me who's not very good at ball, it feels quite good that now I can actually do something. Now I can actually do some damage and disrupt the enemy a bit. But if you're really good on ball, obviously this is going to be insane and the enemy's just going to have a miserable time against you. Overall, I'd say C tier is probably fair. Next up is Zarya, and these changes aren't bad. The bubble one is actually pretty nice, and the grab one does prevent some of the counterplay to it, but I really would have liked to see some more changes here, and so I'm going to put it into D. Following that, we have the hit scan changes by TQQ, and we start off with Ashe, who can now detonate her dynamite again by pressing it, or like pressing it a second time, which is decent, although personally I like that you have to shoot it, but that's just me. And you can also stop Bob, which is good in certain situations and maybe should even be added to the game, but the changes aren't much overall, so I think C tier is pretty fair. Bastion is next, and there's actually a lot of changes here. Now, the passive is actually pretty fun. You can just run into the enemy and just blow up and die, but it can obviously be quite annoying to play against. Then the recon changes feel like they don't do anything. Sure, they increase the damage overall, but like they don't feel kind of pointless in a way. Bringing back healing instead of the grenade is a reasonable change, but personally I quite like the grenade, and so it's not really for me. And then in terms of his assault form, I don't think it's bad. It does feel like an overall nerf, but it's not a bad idea necessarily. It's just fine. So overall, I think B tier is fair for the Bastion. Next up is Cassidy, and only one thing has actually been changed here, but that thing is great. What I'm referring to is the combat roll now being able to launch you in any direction that you're facing. Now, it does take a little getting used to at first, since you can't roll directionally when you're looking forward and trying to shoot, but it does mean that you can do things like rolling straight up into the air, which is really fun, and it gives you a lot of high ground capabilities and stuff. So overall, I do like this change, and it's enough to make its way into B. Reaper is up next, and the passive change is kind of irrelevant, it's just a small buff, but the Ray form change is actually quite fun to use. It mostly just feels different from its current one, which is a good thing. In things like this arcade patch, I like it when they change things a little bit more, so that things actually feel different to the normal game, because otherwise there's not much point of actually playing the arcade mode, you know what I'm saying? So I like that he feels different, and it's quite fun to use, so he's also going to get a B from me. Following on with this trend of changing some movement-based abilities to make the characters more fun, we have Sojourn. And at first the changes do seem kind of bad, because combining them with the seasonal patch notes, her damage overall is just significantly lowered in this mode. However, her power slide can now launch you in any direction just like the combat roll, but it's even better since you get more distance on it. And this means that you can just go flying up into the air, onto high ground, into the enemy backline. It's crazy fun once you get used to using it properly, and it's just an overall great change in my opinion. Maybe not for the normal game, but still very fun to use in this, so it gets an A in my opinion. Next up is Soldier 76, who's gotten a few different changes. Firstly, being able to sprint even faster is quite nice because it just gives you even more movement. But then you can also throw your healing pad, which is really cool. Other than that, not much going on. They buffed his ult a bit, but yeah, pretty decent changes, and so he gets a B. However, breaking our streak of pretty decent changes is Sombra. Now, these changes are just straight up not good. First of all, the biggest one is that when you're invis in your stealth, you can get detected within 20 meters. That is very far. I mean, 4 meters is already like a pretty reasonable distance, but 20 meters is like you can get seen from really far away before you're even in range to do anything to the enemy. And this kind of defeats the whole point of being invisible. I mean, I can respect the attempt to change something, and the translocator speed increase is nice to compensate a bit, but overall I just do not like these changes, and so it gets a D at best. Next up is Tracer, who has gotten basically less health and less damage, but more movement. So they've reduced her health down, they've increased the spread on her guns, which is effectively reducing her damage output, but then they've reduced cooldowns on blink and recall. It's okay, kind of boring. For me personally, it feels like you're a bit weaker overall. It feels like the movement increase isn't really enough to compensate, but that's just me being bad probably. The pulse bomb change is quite nice, but because you can just yeet it and just snipe someone quite far away, so that is actually pretty cool. That's the only thing saving it though, and so it gets a C. Our final hit scan DPS is Widowmaker, who, in fairness, I can respect the changes, and I can respect wanting to nerf Widow, but it feels like she's the only person in the entire patch who's just gotten straight nerfed with like no buffs to compensate, and it just feels really bad. Like, sure, it feels better to play against her, but when you're actually playing as Widow, it feels awful. Partly because like it's just harder to kill people, but also just like when you hit someone, when you shoot someone, that sound effect that you get is just gone. Like, There is no satisfying sound effect whatsoever now, and it just does not feel good, so it gets an easy F in my personal opinion. Now we can move on to the projectile DPS changes by Costa. First off, we have Echo, who can now duplicate allies with her ult, and I actually really like this change. In fact, I think it should maybe even be added to the actual game. However, they've literally done nothing else, and so I can't really put it any higher than C just because there's not much going on. Then we have Genji's change, which also changes his ult, but it kind of feels like it's not really doing much. It just decreases his damage a bit, but gives him a little bit of lifesteal. It's fine, but it feels a little underwhelming, and so it gets a D. Hanzo's change is kind of on the other side of the spectrum. Not necessarily that it's that much better, but they have at least tried to do some stuff. In fact, they've completely changed the way his bow works and brought back scatter arrows for like the 75th time. Like, just give up on scatter arrows at this point. It's been brought back so many times that it's just not exciting anymore. But in terms of a bow, I like that they've tried to change something, but it just doesn't feel good. You can basically shoot way faster, but you do less damage, but having a bow, it feels like it should be rewarding to hit your shots when you have a bow. It feels like that's just kind of a trait of the weapon itself. But now that you only do 70 damage per hit, it just doesn't feel good anymore. And so, in my opinion, these are D tier changes. Junkrat, however, has some interesting stuff. Firstly, they increase the projectile speed on his frag launcher, which is pretty good. Then they also change his ult quite significantly. You can now no longer control it, but it just goes in a straight line. This is fine, but it feels like it's just objectively worse. I haven't personally gotten it to work. It does seem interesting overall, an interesting concept, but it just doesn't really function properly. I'm still going to give these changes a B just about, but they aren't the best. Then Mei has two changes, and firstly she can shoot the ground to freeze it, and so she can walk faster on it. I'm pretty sure that's a returning change from some previous April Fool's patch or something, but it's still pretty good. And then the blizzard changes are actually pretty cool, that it's centered around her, but it roots them. You just need to keep in mind that when you are using it, that it doesn't stun them, and they can still shoot you. But overall, the changes are not bad by any means, and so I think B is pretty fair. Following that, we have Pharah, who has some pretty good changes. I mean, the overhealth change doesn't matter all that much. It's nice, it's a decent buff, but it just makes it even harder to take out if you're on the enemy team. But the rocket barrage change is really nice. Now, they've not actually done that much, but you can now use your jump jet or your jet dash abilities when you're ulting, which I think is really good. Obviously, you can argue that when you're barraging, it should be high risk, high reward, like you should be making yourself vulnerable. But then again, being able to just like dash to the side during it is like a huge amount of mobility, but it's still like a decent change, to be honest, and I think it seems quite fun. And so honestly, I know it isn't much, but I think Pharah deserves an A. Following that trend, Symmetra also has two main changes. The first one is that her teleporter forcibly teleports you, but it can also teleport the enemy team, which I do think is pretty cool. It's quite different from her standard teleporter, but it means that you can kind of try and kidnap the enemy if you want to, or then again, if you just put it for movement, then the enemy can take it to follow you. So it goes both ways, but overall I think it's a pretty cool change. Then the turret change is actually really cool, being able to create walls with it, but it just doesn't work. And when I say that, I mean that like the enemy can see the beams, so they can just shoot. They can see the turrets, they can just shoot the turrets. There's no reason for them to walk into the beams when they're right there. So the turrets in concept is good, but like they just don't actually help you as your normal turrets would, and so they don't actually do anything useful. But overall, I do still like the changes, and so it gets a B for creativity at the least. Next, Torb's level 3 turret is back when he uses Overload, and oh god is it strong. I did not realize level 3 turret was this crazy. But nothing else has really changed. I mean, it's pretty annoying to play against, I won't lie, when he just overloads and suddenly the turret has like so much HP and just does a huge amount of damage. But it's a fine change, but I don't really think it can deserve more than D, maybe C, but yeah. The final DPS is Venture, and oh god, Costa did not even try. This is literally the worst set of changes in the entire mode. I'm not gonna lie, I probably need to make a separate tier just for Venture, because at least would have actually got changed somewhat. I mean, Venture, they increase her ult duration, but you still have the same amount of shots, and now it has fall-off damage. Like, what is the point? Those changes are the most useless, like, they don't do anything. I do not like these changes at all. I think there's so much you could have done and so little that was done, and I'm putting this into Venture tier, which is below F. Now then, we move on to the support changes by Eskay. And first off, we have Anna, who, similarly to Mirror Watch, she gets some additional movement. She instead of this time takes Baptiste's Exo Boots as a passive. This is pretty cool. Obviously, it makes her way too survivable and really strong, but it is still pretty fun. She also has faster reload, which feels pretty nice. Obviously, she would be way too strong like this in the normal game, but that's not a huge issue. The only issue that it creates is that some characters didn't really get buffed, but then Anna gets this huge buff. You know, the balancing is really off, but it's still a pretty fun change, and so I think B is fair. Next up is Baptiste, and not much has actually been changed, but he does gain increased movement speed when he's like jumping through the air, which I do like. Honestly, I would love to give this higher, but because that's the only thing that's been changed, I can only give it B. I do really like the change though, and it feels good to use. Brigitte has gotten some decent changes as well. And finally, Inspire now has an icon on your HUD for your teammates when you're actually being healed by it, which is a great quality of life change, and honestly one which should be added to the main game. Like, it's just a great change that it's not actually a buff, but it just needs to be put into the game. Then she also gets some movement speed after she uses the bash, which isn't really necessary, but the fact that it doesn't stop momentum is really nice, and nothing else is done, but just because these changes feel so good, I have to put it in A. Following that is Iliari, who now has 2 healing powers instead of just 1, but they've nerfed the healing. Now this doesn't actually take into account the seasonal patch notes which buffed for healing, so I don't know if that's intentional or not, but overall it's a fine change. It could be better. I feel like it overall is actually healing nerf because they have separate cooldowns, or they don't have separate cooldowns, but they have stacking cooldowns. So if you put them in bad spots and they die, they're just gone for way too long, and it's fine, but I can't put it higher than C. Then Lifeweaver did get some good changes. He's got on 2 petal platforms, which I think is pretty nice. And then other than that, he's gotten some pure number buffs. But the weapon swap speed increase is actually so good. I wish they added this to the actual game. Blizzard, if you're watching this now, add this change to the actual game. It is so like good for Lifeweaver's character. It doesn't actually buff him that much, but it's just really good. And so he gets a B in my opinion. Next is Lucio, and I'm actually a little bit disappointed with these changes. I think there was a lot more that could have been done. I do like the sound barrier change, where if you fall for longer, then it gives more overhealth, because, you know, if you're falling from a higher height, it's a higher risk that the enemies is able to do something before that, either kill your teammates before you land or stop you from doing it. So I do like that high risk, high reward kind of thing, but overall, like, just not much has actually been done, so I think it kind of deserves the D tier, to be honest. Then we have Kiriko, who's only gotten 1 change. It's to her teleport, and now she can teleport without actually targeting an ally. Now, even if this did work, it would make Kiri even harder to kill and thereby more annoying to play against. It would give her even more flank potential. It's just unnecessary. Like, it can be fun to use if it works, that is, but it doesn't even work properly. That's the issue. Because now, sometimes when I'm trying to TP to my teammates, it doesn't even let me TP to my teammates. I just like teleport into the wall instead. Like, it just doesn't work. It's just a mess. And so, like, I literally cannot give it any higher than D for that reason alone. Next is Mercy, and I do actually quite like how they've changed the res, how now you only get res for 10 seconds and then you die again. Obviously, it feels very different to the normal res, and some people have been annoyed at that, I get that. But for being in an arcade mode, I do actually quite like it because it changes the playstyle with it quite a bit. Other than that, also gets a little bit more movement. You know, it's pretty decent changes overall. I actually quite like them, so I'm putting it in B. Penultimately, the Mora change isn't actually that bad of an idea, being able to headshot enemies with your grasp, but because they didn't balance out her other damage, it basically just promotes DPS Mora because now she can do even more damage, thereby even more lifesteal. It's just crazy, and we do not like DPS Mora, so that is an F. Then finally is Zen, and these changes are actually really fun. He can basically kick the ground to fly up, or like if he can kick any terrain, he moves in the opposite direction, which I think is really cool. And of course, he can also fly with his ult. Overall, they're cool changes, they're pretty fun, and I think A is pretty reasonable. So, there you have it. Overall, I do quite enjoy this mode, as I like this type of thing in general. However, this one in particular feels a little too inconsistent. Some heroes got entire kit overhauls like Hog and Hanzo, whereas others were barely even touched like Baptiste. This made it very difficult to rank them as there was no clear criteria of what this mode was actually trying to do. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe for more content and I'll see you next time.